Okay, this is the constructive and destructive forces reteach video. Let's begin by looking at what a destructive force is. A destructive force describes a process where land is being destroyed or taken away. And I would remind you also that if you look at the root word in destructive, it is destroy. And if you think about examples where things are being destroyed, they're being taken away. Destructive forces are the same thing. If you look at the picture, you can see that it's a coastal area. You have some rock formations, you have some soil and some grass on top of that, and even some buildings in the background. Destructive forces have shaped and changed this coastline. So you have the waves crashing into the coast. You have the wind picking up fine pieces of sediment and rock and gravel and just throwing them into these cliff faces, and it works like a sand blaster. But over time, those destructive forces have shaped and changed this coastal area, and they're destructive forces because they are taking away the land that was once there. Weathering is another type of destructive force. Weathering is just the breaking down of rocks, sediment, and other materials into smaller pieces. There are two types of weathering. The first type is physical weathering, and the other type is chemical weathering. First, let's look at what physical weathering is. Physical weathering is an example where rocks are broken down, and you end up with the same thing that you started with. So it's a physical change. You can reverse that. You can get back what you started with if you wanted to. I'll provide you with an example of this in the next picture. Chemical weathering is when you end up with something new and different at the end. So a chemical change is irreversible. You can't go back. So you end up with something different than you start with. So again, another example of that also on the next page. Okay, here's physical weathering. The most common type of physical weathering is something called frost wedging, and this happens all the time in areas of the country that have seasons, because when water gets into cracks or low-lying spaces, it freezes, and then the water expands, and then that crack gets a little bit bigger. And then over time, as more water gets in there and freezes, the crack gets larger and larger until eventually the ice will break the rock into two pieces or a couple pieces, like you see on the right-hand side there. And this happens in northeast Ohio because all of our roads are paved with asphalt, and that's really porous. So water gets in there, and it freezes, and it expands, and it breaks up the road, and it makes it a pain to drive on. The other type of weathering is chemical weathering, and this is the chemical change that's irreversible. Acid rain, carbonization, and oxidation are all examples of chemical reactions that take place with chemical weathering. In the picture that you see there, that's some type of rock that has minerals that have the element iron in them. Iron is a metal, and what happens when it's exposed to oxygen and the other gases in the atmosphere, a chemical reaction takes place, and it oxidizes or it rusts. Acid rain is another example of chemical weathering, and how that works is we pollute the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels or CFCs or other bad stuff, and when it rains, the rainwater is slightly acidic, not acidic enough to damage plants or hurt animals or anything like that. It just becomes slightly more acidic and is a little bit more powerful in terms of being able to break down rocks and soil. So we talked about the weathering part. That is the breaking down of material. Once that material is broken down, it gets carried from one place to another. And the way that that broken down material gets carried is through erosion. So erosion is the process of transporting that broken down material. And then the picture here you see some erosion taking place. So the cliff face or the coastline there was broken down by all of the factors that are at work there, the gases in the atmosphere, the wind, the waves crashing into the coastline. So all of that is working on breaking down the material, and then the erosion is just transporting it from one place to another. Erosion and weathering are often confused also because they both happen at the exact same time. Okay, there are 5 different types of erosion. There is wind, water, waves, ice, and gravity. And again, these are just the different ways that broken down material can get carried from one place to another. The wind can carry broken down material, water can carry it in terms of a river like you see in this picture, waves, and that's considered more open water like in an ocean. Ice in the form of glaciers or frost wedging, the freezing and thawing, expanding and breaking. And then gravity, I'm going to make a little mark here on gravity because gravity can actually work with any of the other 4. So it's usually never just waves, it's never just water or wind or ice, it's always water and gravity, or waves and gravity. Gravity always works in tandem with the other 4. So we talked about destructive forces that take away land, weathering and erosion. There are also some constructive forces that work to add the land. So this is where new land is being made or it's being created. And in the picture that you see here, that's a beach or a coastal area, and you can see that the sand was carried by the waves, by the wind, and it was deposited and laid down on the beach, and that would be a constructive force. If you look at the root word, constructive, okay, the root word is construct. And if you're constructing something, you are building. I wanted to come up with an example that I thought would help you understand the difference between erosion and deposition. To start off with, the dump truck on the left is supposed to represent erosion. Now, erosion is a destructive force, which means that it destroys land and it takes it away. So the dump truck on the left, the bin on the backside is full of material that's been broken down already. The dump truck is carrying it or driving it from one place to another. That's how erosion works. Whether it is waves, wind, water, ice, or gravity, the broken down material is getting transported from one place to another, just like you see in the dump truck there. Deposition is different. Deposition is a constructive force, which means that it is making new land. So the dump truck has stopped, and all the material that was in the bin is being dropped off and put down. The root word in deposition is deposit, and if you're depositing something, you are putting it somewhere. So that's how erosion and deposition are different. The erosion is the transporting, the deposition is the laying down, dropping off. You can see this in a real-life example on the bottom. On the left, you can see the sand is blowing. Well, that is weathering and erosion, the picking up and the transporting of the material, and the force of erosion that will be working there would be wind. And then you see on the right-hand side that material is deposited and laid down, making a sand dune. So that's the difference between erosion and deposition.